So our text today is the second last parable that Jesus tells at all in the Gospel of Matthew. After this, only the speech to the disciples is left, where he says, "Just as you did to one of the least of these, you did to me," which is next week's text. And then we're already in the midst of the Passion, Jesus' betrayal, death, and resurrection. So we are at the very end of Jesus' ministry, where he's talking about how the disciples should live on without him, what the future of the Jesus movement will be, and what part the disciples will have to play in it. After the parables of the last couples of weeks, we're already in the end of time mood. No one knows the day of the hour. The 5 lazy bridesmaids are excluded. The disciples should keep awake, be alert, watchful, and now here. The worthless slave is thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What a threatening image of the future. How does this text make you feel? Uncomfortable? And who is the third slave? Could it be you or me? How would you have acted? Would you have taken the talents given by the master and gone into trading, generating a win, in fact doubling the capital by taking the risk to lose it all as well? Or are you someone who likes to play it safe and bury the money where it doesn't produce win, but you're also not losing any? Does not the action of the third slave show that he's a considerate, prudent man that acts responsibly with something that isn't his own, that is only entrusted to him? And does not therefore the reaction of the master feel unjust, inappropriate, exaggerated, throwing him into the outer darkness without any empathy? Does not the master, in his harsh words, appear greedy? Only those that produce win are people to his taste. He has not lost a single denarii. He got back exactly what he had entrusted to the third slave. But no, he prefers the 2 that produce abundant profit by taking risk with something that wasn't their own. So what are we to make of this text and the uncomfortableness it leaves us with? First of all, I think we have to look into the first century money and understand the master-slave system to hear the parable in a way Jesus' listeners would have. The money first. A talent is not a currency, but a certain amount of money. To be more precise, it is an enormous amount of money. 1 talent are 6,000 denarii. 1 denarii is the money a day laborer would receive for 1 day of work. So 1 talent is the wages for a little over 16 years of work. 2 talents would be wages for 33 years of work, and that at a time where the anticipated average lifespan was roughly 50 years. 5 talents would be the wages worth of 82 years of work. This is just an insane amount of money, ridiculously high, something that would have made the disciples laugh and dream. Like our popular question, what would you do with $1 million? Was it a common thing to entrust slaves with money? Yes, it was. Slavery came to a bloom in the Roman Empire, and an extremely large part of the population were slaves. Slavery was the basis on which the Roman Empire stood, and higher-ranked slaves were preferably trusted with the administration of property and the management of finances, because they had one significant advantage. In contrast to a Roman citizen, torturing a slave was legal. Their status was a helpful leverage to be true to their master's interests. And all this was known to the disciples. So the master doesn't do something extraordinary in trusting his slaves with his money while leaving the country. The extraordinary thing was the crazy, huge, enormous, generous amount of money he gave them for safekeeping. And the text says, he gave to each according to his ability. Does the master still appear strict or harsh to you? Let's jump a few hundred years forward in time. Once there was a man who lived in fear of the wrath of God. He suffered under the image that God would punish him. Fear, anxiety, fighting against the terror of having to face God's final harsh, strict, and unforgiving judgment someday, and at the same time feeling utterly helpless and sinful. We know from his writings that the fear paralyzed him, tortured him, made him unable to see the joy of living and the chances and paths that life opened to him. Fear was his guiding emotion through life, and he was imprisoned by his fear of God and desperate because there was no escape. This man, you might have guessed it, was Martin Luther. But it's not the fear he became famous for. Despite, or maybe because of, his fear and terror, he kept searching and looking for an answer to the question, what do I have to do to make God look with graciousness upon me? After studying, reading, teaching the Bible to students for years and praying and meditating a lot, he made the discovery that changed the course of world history. Not he himself had to do something. There was no act per se that was required of him. He just had the wrong image of God. God is loving and forgiving, full of mercy and grace all along. But his very own image of God didn't allow him to perceive and believe in a loving God. And this, you can almost say, minor discovery had an enormous impact on his view of the world and especially the church around him. The practice of indulgence was used to have the small people pay for the luxurious life and the striving for power of corrupt church leaders. By only looking and emphasizing their sinfulness and the punishment they would receive after death, they kept the people in line. Luther's image of a merciful, loving God opened a new possibility: the individual image of God, undictated by the church. Let's jump back to the parable, keeping Luther's story in mind. When the master returns, after a long time, he settles accounts with the slaves. The first and second slave both doubled the amount of money entrusted, and the master says, "Well done, good and trustworthy slaves. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." He therein transforms his relationship with them from master-slave to something approaching equality. The third slave, however, says, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." And this reveals so much. I knew that you were a harsh man. Do you still think that's true after reading about the master's generosity and how kindly he interacts with the other slaves? I think what the third slave is saying is, in my mind, my image of you is that of a harsh, unforgiving man, and I was, and I am still afraid of you. Therefore, I made sure to keep your money at a safe place and see that nothing got lost. What is your image of God? Can you relate to the fear of the slave or young Martin Luther? Fear of God, fear of events happening in your life that paralyze you, that prevent you from living up to your possibilities? Fear that imprisons you and makes you not see what is happening around you, what is needed around you, that makes you ignore your own talents, because that is where the word comes from. If we let fear rule our lives, and I know that we sometimes can't help it, we end up in the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. I have been there before, have you? But if we can see beyond our fears, we can recognize God's love also in this parable. God demonstrates love by limiting God's self and letting us learn. God is limiting God's self, goes away, and therein provides the distance and room that we need to lead, to grow, to take chances, and to flourish. God is generous in providing for us with all the means that we need: talents, gifts, space, creation. And now we are called to shape this, our world, talents, lives, communities, futures, and even fortunes. And what we are asked to is to live faithfully. Faithful is not static. Yet like the third slave, we are good at knowing without doing. We are adept at holding on to a talent entrusted to us, knowing what we should do and what we could do with it, but not doing so. We know what faithful living looks like, but we hesitate to live it. We bury too much goodness, time, love, treasure, and talent in the ground. Why? Perhaps some of us feel our talent is too small to truly make a difference. Others may feel resentment or jealousy about another's wealth or abilities. Or, like in this parable, it is fear and distrust that paralyze us. But we have real choices and power, with genuine consequences resulting from the ways we use our freedom. What we do or fail to do shapes this world and our lives. It is not the only factor, but it is nonetheless crucial. So let us not be inactive when we see injustice happening around us, even if it's not directly concerning ourselves. Let us not only be focused on those whose well-being would directly influence ours. Let us speak up, support, question, where words, practices, habits, traditions, worldviews are limiting the lives and opportunities of others. Let us make use of the talents, abilities, fortunes, and experiences God entrusted us with to help our community, our nation, and our world to heal. And that way, enter into the joy of our Master, who is a God of love. Amen.